Well, I just want to welcome to everyone to Med School Interviews, Insider Secrets. My name is Hallie Caldwell, and I work with Inspira Advantage, which is a company that consults with applicants on their applications, helps students study for MCATs and every other test within the medical school field. And we have consultants that are from all of the top med schools that help students apply, help with personal statements, secondary applications, and really the entire application process. So I'll just give you a brief overview of what we talk about before I introduce our two panelists. So we'll go over introductions. We'll talk about the different interview types that you might experience. And the different methods for those. We'll talk about navigating common questions, do's and don'ts, and then we'll have a Q&A section. So feel free to pop your question, any questions that you have through this presentation into the Q&A box. And at the end, we'll get to all of those questions. All right, so Chiamaka, Neil, thank you both so much for being here. I'd love for you both just tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive in. Chiamaka, you want to start off?
Thank you, Hallie. My name is Chiamaka Okorie. I am what I call a rising fourth year medical student at Dartmouth. So I say rising because I am currently taking a research year. I have been on the admissions committee this is my third year on the admissions committee at Dartmouth.
Yeah, hey guys, I'm Neil. I finished up med school at Michigan almost a year and a half ago now. I was on the admissions committee there for a couple of years. I'm doing a residency now in dermatology at NYU in New York.
All right, thank you both. So let's go over some different types of interviews that you might experience.
Yeah, so I can take this one. First off, I know my video is not the prime quality for what you guys should be shooting for when you guys are doing med school interviews if they're virtual. I think we may go over that a little bit later, but apologies for that in my small New York apartment. There are two main types of interviews, I guess, if you want to bucket them, that you're going to experience as med school interviewees. The traditional interview style, which is the majority, I think that you're going to experience are being interviewed by one person, usually like a long form interview where they ask you questions either about your application if they've already seen it or if they're blinded to it, maybe more like behavioral type questions, which we'll go into what that means later. There are panel interviews as well, a few of which I had. That's more common probably in residency interviews, but again, they're sort of question-based, but they're usually more behavioral questions like, what do you do in this situation? What's a conflict you've experienced before, etc. Often students will interview you along with the faculty members. The student interviews are usually much more relaxed. The faculty member ones are a little scarier because they're faculty, but again, they're not scary people. They just want to get to know you. And like I mentioned earlier, they can be closed file, meaning they've seen your maybe essay, but they haven't really seen the rest of your application. They haven't seen your scores, or they could be open file, or they could be somewhere in between. Open file meaning they've seen everything. And the schools probably will not tell you beforehand which one they're going to be doing.
All right, let's move on to the next type here. We have virtual interviews.
So because of COVID, the pandemic happened and a lot of schools had to pivot. So virtual interviewing is now a thing. I would say here at Dartmouth, we only do virtual interviews now. I actually like the virtual interview format because cost of interviewing was part of the disparity we were seeing in medicine, being able to fly around the country, but now you can sit in the comfort of your own home and do your virtual interview. I would like to dissuade people's fears around virtual interviews. Most people think that your background, a lot of things has to be perfect during a virtual interview. Actually, virtual interviews can be a real insight into your life. If you have kids who are running in the background, if you have a pet who video bombs you, that actually just adds to the flair of who you are. Obviously, if you're like me, you live alone, no pets, nothing at all, you can have just your own background. That's also fair and fine. So just make sure you're not being nervous about what mishaps might happen in the virtual interview space. Yes, if you can help it. I know a lot of my people who are interviewing for residency right now, they're buying ring lights, and you're making sure, like Neil is mentioning about his New York apartment, if they feel like their apartment just doesn't have the best lighting, they find like a comfortable study space somewhere that they can have a private session during their interviews. That's always good advice, right? So my advice for you during your virtual interviewing is, one, if you can find a stable, plain background, really no one's judging you, but always be professional. If you can have a good background, I would actually say, like right now, you can see that I have a blurred background. I would suggest that you don't have a blurred background, really, like, because I think like the blurred background is I'm here as, the professional talking to all of you. But when I'm interviewing candidates, I think the blur can be a little more interesting. So you just want us to be able to just have that insight into your life. Obviously, we don't want to look into your life, but if you can have a good background for us. So there are two types of virtual interviews. You have the live interview. The live interview is basically like your traditional interview. You might have one-on-one interaction with a committee member. That committee member can either be a faculty, staff, or a student. I know that it's been mentioned that a student interview is more laid back, but a student's score and how they present you to the committee has just as much weight as any faculty member on the committee. If you end up being so relaxed that you end up making the student feel like you didn't respect them as your interviewer, that can actually come back to the committee. So just make sure that you're taking every single interviewer as seriously as you can. Close the open file is the same way. Most of your interviewers might tell you at the beginning of your interviews that if they've read your full file or not. You might be able to gauge too by the type of questions they're asking you. A lot of interviewers have these questions that they ask every single person they interview just to mitigate bias. But if they're asking you specific questions about you, then it might point towards them looking into your file. So the pre-recorded interview, there's no interviewer present. Usually the school will send you a question list for you to make a video response. That can always be good because you can take multiple shots of that, make sure everyone looks at it. You always want other people looking at whatever you're submitting. Really, you've looked at your application multiple times. A lot of things start to jumble in your head. You really want other people looking at these videos, and your response is then shared with the admission committee members.
Yes,
Yeah.
comprehensive. Chiamaka, sorry, what were you going to say, Allie?
I was going to ask if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, just the one thing I would add, just to, kind of add to what she said about the backgrounds. So as an interviewer, as someone who's interviewed a lot during residency, sometimes people like to ask about the backgrounds too. I mean, if you have something fun in the background, if you have something that you, like a hobby, like you play the guitar and you have a guitar in the background, they'll ask about it. So it's a good way to use up time during interviews as well. If they see something in there that resonates with them, it could be something fun to talk about. So yeah, I would agree with not blurring the background, and maybe even introducing some things that you'd want to talk about.
Great. All right, let's talk about some group interviews now.
Yeah, these are funky. So I had one or two of these when I was interviewing for med school. These don't happen in residency, but these are basically interviews where you are with maybe one or two faculty and one or two students. So you guys are all answering questions together. They may pose a question and then you guys kind of answer in turn. The dynamics of this are weird because, you know, all the pressure is not necessarily on you as the one student answering the question. You may get to feed off someone else's answer, but you may have to go first too. So it's kind of a game, but, you know, I wouldn't be too stressed about it. Really, the point of the group interviews is to see how you kind of work on a team. Can you interact well with others? Do you give other people the chance to speak? Do you hog the spotlight? You kind of want to be somebody who can fit well into that setting. It can be easy sometimes, I guess, just thinking back to get tripped up, you know, listening to other people's accomplishments. If they start talking about those, you may feel a little insecure. Do your best not to compare yourself. And if you're on the other side of that balancing act, do your best not to overshadow other people. And actively listen to other people's answers as well. If you show that you're actively listening, it would reflect well on you. You know, if you integrate another person's answer into yours, for example. Some schools do this again. I think Drexel, Brown, Northwestern may have done this. But, you know, this isn't the only interview type those schools will offer. They're going to have like a long form interview as well, or maybe an MMI, which we'll talk about in the next slide.
Chiamaka, anything to add to group interviews before we move on?
I echo everything Neil has said about group interviews. I think one of the things you're going to hear from whoever ends up being your admissions consultant, if you end up with Inspira, is that admissions persona. Like, who are you as a candidate? Like, what are the things that are so important that whoever is on the admissions committee should know about you? So when you're answering these questions, like, make sure obviously you're not dominating the questions, but make sure you're like trying to incorporate those things too in your answers. Like, okay, I want them to know that I have this and that, not in an obnoxious way, but making sure you're doing it very deliberately when you give those answers in your group interviews.
Great. So we'll move on to MMIs now. And I do just want to say we do have another webinar on Tuesday that's focused solely on MMIs. So we'll give you a great overview here, but you can sign up on our website, same place you signed up for this webinar to join that, and we'll go into much more detail there.
Yeah, so the MMI is another non-traditional, I guess, type of interview setting where you basically, as the interviewee, you'll be traveling between 6 to 10 rooms where you might get like 5 to 8 minutes in a variety of settings. The reason I keep it vague is because it's very varied in what you can expect in those different rooms. A lot of students think this is kind of intimidating because you only get 5 minutes. You know, if you mess up, it feels like the end of the world, but it's really not. The diversification of the different settings means that a lot of people are evaluating. So if you mess up once, it's no big deal at all. The scenarios are usually actors. They either hire standardized patients or hire med students who are on and off rotation or something to come by and either do maybe like an essay writing station, or they might even have a standard interview station where they ask you about you know, one interview question, like one long form interview question. What's a failure you've experienced? What's a conflict you've experienced? The most classic that I remember is a teamwork station where you might have to sit back to back, for example, and instruct the other how to build a tower out of magnetic sticks, or you may have to tell them how to put shapes together to create a picture. And the whole idea is, how do you communicate with each other to complete a task? And you'll be on both sides of that chair at one point during the interview. There may be an ethical scenario. Those are pretty tough usually because you may not be prepared for it. But if you have a few scenarios in mind before you go in, you can kind of adapt you know, your answers to whatever question comes up. Sometimes there's a rest station as well, where you can kind of just chill for 6 minutes, which is nice. And this is becoming more common, I guess I would say. Michigan definitely had these even when I was interviewing back in the day. Stanford as well, probably a bunch more. And it's usually, again, not the, just like the group interviews, it's not the only interview type. They usually mix these in with long form interviews. So you may have 2 long form interviews throughout the day and then an MMI station as well.
Chiamaka, anything else you want to contribute there?
Yeah.
All right, we'll move on to the next slide here. Interview prep methods and tips.
So once you have that interview, I know if you're in Reddit or if you're on other forums, everyone's so excited to share that they have this interview. Really, an interview means that they believe that you will succeed if you come to their medical school. And when I say that, I mean they believe that you've met whatever that criteria they have for their student body. So once you have that interview, at that point, your grades don't matter. You're now back to the same playing field as every single person getting an interview. So what matters at that point? Fit. Fit. How are you going to fit with our mission and our vision and our culture, right? So as much as every single pre-med student is so worried, like, I want to do so well during my interview, I think one thing you should prep is this school also a good fit for me? Because they're auditioning to be your med school as much as you're auditioning to be their med student. It's a symbiotic relationship. You're going to add so much to the class. You're going to grow so much and they need you, right? You're going to end up being a physician if you end up, well, all things considered, if you start in their med school, they're hoping you're going to graduate as a physician someday. So that is a huge responsibility on your part, as much as it's a huge responsibility on your part. So scores don't matter. Back to the drawing board. What should I do to prep for my interview? Practice really does make perfect. But be careful that you do not over rehearse. I actually have videos which I look back very fondly at during my interview prep sections. Like, I had a friend who was a physician at the time, and he would sit with me and we would record myself answering some of the questions. And I would go back and I'll look at the video and I'm like, why did I cock my head? Like, why did I say that? Maybe I should make it shorter. Maybe I shouldn't ramble as much. You really want to practice those answers, because the more you practice, the more some of the answers start to flow naturally to you and some of the nuances start to like fit together. But you don't want to sound over rehearsed. So when you get to the interview, make sure you can deviate from that checklist you have for yourself. Speaking in front of the mirror can sound awkward, but it can show you what you look like. Virtual interviews. I just had a student this week that I interviewed, and I really was like so confused because I couldn't tell where he was looking. I wasn't sure if there was something going on. Obviously I didn't mention it, and it's not something I took personally or ding him for, because we're all human, but you really don't want that to be a question in your interviewer's mind, and you just don't know how much grace they're going to afford you. So you really want to practice looking at the interviewer when you're speaking. Virtual interviewing is a skill, and you want to like call your family members, call your friends, ask them, how are my hand, I do love hand gestures. How are my hand gestures? Where am I looking? All of those things. Is my outfit, like, should I move back a little more? Should I come in a little more? Those are just nuances you want to make sure you streamline before your interview day. An added tip, always ensure you have a stable connection. I've heard people use the Ethernet as a way to circumvent not having a stable internet, which if you can't do that, that's perfect. I've had an interviewee who just, their internet was not acting right. You want to address that. If you realize that your internet is cutting out, just address that and tell them, I think my internet is having a problem. if we end up getting disconnected, I will be able to call back because I have a backup. Like, make sure you address that if you're noticing a lag during your interview. Don't just hope for the best, and like, because professionalism means that you're like addressing things head on. Mock interviewing is by far the best way to prepare. Most pre-med committees hold mock interviews. Do not miss that, because from my pre-med committee, when they wrote me my pre-med committee letter, they modeled what I said to them during my mock interview. So it's a way for them to get to know you and get to know what you're presenting to the med schools as their alum, and a way for you to like get feedback from them. So make sure you're using your mock interviews as well as you can. If you end up working with an admissions counselor, there's always part of a package that you can get and get that interview prep there. Make sure I use a lot of arms, I use a lot of fillers. When the nerve kicks in, don't stress out, because we're all human, but if you can speak as clearly as whatever you want to come across to the interviewer, make sure you're coming across those very clearly. Mind your body language. I'm saying this because this is me. I am very flamboyant when I talk. I'm always moving my head. You just don't know your interviewer's personality, so you always want to make sure you're containing yourself as much as you can, but make sure you're being true to yourself also, because they will realize that you're not being, if you're a little rigid and that's just not who you are, your interviewer will sense that. So make sure you're being true to yourself, but also knowing that this is a professional, serious event happening right now. Open body language is always better. I really like the leaning method, especially if someone's speaking to you and you want to show that you're listening. Like, the leaning is always a favorite of mine. Open body language, not too closed off, especially in an in-person interview. You don't want the other person to start getting nervous, because we reflect the other person. Like, we bounce off body language and energies and all that. So you want to make sure you're coming across as relaxed and open. You can subtly mirror what your interviewer is doing. So if your interviewer is a little more relaxed, I would say like lean into that. Don't get unprofessional, but if they're relaxed and you're rigid, that's a problem. If they're more formal and you're just making jokes after jokes, that's a problem. So make sure you're, in summary, make sure you're practicing, making use of your mentors, making use of your resources, and just like go down the list of what on my application, if they ask me this on my application, how can I answer that? The worst thing is for someone to ask you something on your application. You gave us this. Everything we're looking at, you gave it to us. You wrote it down. You should know yourself way better than we do. If we ask you about something you did that you put on your CV or you put on your application, and you cannot expand on that, that actually looks like you lied on your application, or you lied on your CV, or there's something off about you. So make sure you know your application back and front. So when you're preparing, go back and read your application and make sure you know it back and forth. The next slide is navigating common interview questions. You're going to find that even if you have admission members who've read your file, most people like a tell me about yourself question. That is, you just have to have a tell me about yourself answer prepped. If you don't have that, you're ready. That's a given. I would say approach tell me about yourself as an elevator pitch. So if I meet you in an elevator right now, right? I see Neil on an elevator, I see Hallie on an elevator, and I'm like, oh, you're interviewing for my med school. This elevator is going to like the 5th floor. Tell me about yourself. Make sure it's that concise, but hits every single thing you want them to know. think of it as when this person is presenting me to the committee and they're like, who is this student? What are the 3, 4, 5 things that they need to know about me? This does not have to only be your academic achievement, really. I mean, your family counts, the adversities you've had in your life counts, what you're passionate about counts, what you think you're going to add to the class. If you're going to be the yoga instructor of your class, if you're going to be the baker of your class, if you're going to be the dancer in your class, make sure they're realizing those parts of your persona. So most people always like stick with the academics, but really like show other parts of yourself in that tell me about yourself question. Other interesting questions, I think when you work with other people, I have a list of 30 question banks I pull from when I interview my students, but you always want to make sure you have the most common questions, you have answers to those common questions. Where do you see yourself in X years? When I think back at one interview question that haunts me, I was in an interview and an interviewer asked me this question and I was so naive. I mean, I knew I wanted to go to med school. I knew I probably wanted to do, I did not even know what specialty I wanted to do. I'm a first generation college student, first generation in medicine. So I really did not have anyone to model to answer that question. So really sit down with yourself and ask yourself, even if like life happens, things change, you just want to give them a concrete enough answer that just shows that you've thought about this journey well enough.
Neil, I know that you have an approach to the tell us about yourself question. Do you want to share that before we move on?
Yeah, sure. I just threw in the comments too. One other thing I want to add about the slide before too. I know that I agree with Chiamaka that over preparing is bad. You'll sound robotic. It just won't end up well for you. But I know that a lot of medical students are very type A personality. They will over prepare. It's inevitable. I would try to prepare. If you do that, I would try to, throw in some pauses, throw in some areas where, at least you look like you're thinking about what you're about to say. So it doesn't come out as, overly robotic or rehearsed. For the tell me about yourself. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize attendees couldn't see the chat. So I have a little bit of a business background. When I was doing business interviews, I was taught this peel the onion method for the tell me about yourself question, which basically says that, when they ask that question, give a very superficial overview of yourself. You don't have to go into very much depth. You're going to lose the interviewer if you talk over 60 seconds. So talk about, where you're from, what your background is very briefly, why you're here, maybe throw in some hobbies, but throw in little hooks that the interviewer can latch onto and sort of peel back on if they're very interested. So I'm a tennis player, I might throw in that I'm interested in tennis. If the interviewer is a tennis player, they might ask who's your favorite tennis player. We get into a whole conversation about that. If they're interested in my research, or if they are from Southern Indiana like I am, we might have a whole conversation about that. So throw in little tidbits about yourself they can kind of latch onto, but you don't need to expand on anything in very much depth. They'll do that for you if they're interested.
Great. All right. Have questions for your interviewer. Neil, you want to pick this up?
Yeah, this is, this is tough sometimes. You always want to have questions prepared, definitely at the end of your interview. You don't want to ask the most generic questions. You don't want to ask questions about the curriculum that you can find online. They should be pretty thoughtful, and they should reflect your own interests, I think, in my opinion. When I was preparing for residency interviews, I would look up my interviewer. I would find topics that we could connect on and personalize my questions to them. That may not be possible for med school interviews all the time, but I would at least ask questions that are personal to your own application and your own story for why you're coming to medical school. Some of these are great questions. If you're interested in research opportunities, you may ask how easy it is to get research. Are faculty responsive to research inquiries, cold emails, etc.? Asking how students are evaluated, or if you get feedback, is a very common question when we're interviewing for residencies. But, you know, as an example for myself, I'm interested in the intersection of technology and medicine, for example. So something I would ask is, you know, how easy it is to get involved with other colleges on campus. Can I interact with a business school? Can I interact with a computer science school, or an engineering school? Is that an easy thing to facilitate? That was pretty personal to my application. I think people liked it because it was unique and it kind of showed that I was interested. So that would be sort of the approach I take, I guess. Take some time to think about what questions you want to ask, and make sure it's tailored to you.
Chiamaka, anything else there?
I agree with that. I mean, if at the end of the interview, if you've had this robust conversation and you just really don't have any questions and they've answered all your questions, that would be amazing. But I doubt that. I mean, most people, where you go to med school, any USMD school, DO school is going to train you to be a fair and good physician. And most times you can get into what specialty you want. But fit really matters. Where is going to be best for your family dynamics, if you have any, your mental health, whatever cultural niche you want. There are different aspects to you that you care about, and you really want to ask your interviewer if they have that insight. I love when students ask me questions that make me brag about Dartmouth. So, you know, asking what improvements I've seen since I've been a student for my first year. What do I love most about my classmates? What do I wish we could do better? Just those insights. I always am like excited to answer those questions, because I'm like, I think we could do this better, or I really love that we've done this better. But when you ask those questions that are related to you, it shows that you're taking this process seriously, because you're going to be dedicating 4 years of your life to the school, and not just the school, to the community, to that state. There are all these layers to it, right? Like, I know that we might just be this nervous person that just wants to get this acceptance and wants to show that I would come here if you accept me, but really you're here and this is going to be your life. You're going to be adulting as you're going through med school. So you really want to show that you're taking that process seriously and you're asking these questions.
Great. All right. I'm seeing some great Q&A questions come in, and don't worry, we will get to those in just a couple more minutes. All right, so let's talk about some do's and don'ts for interviews. Chiamaka, you want to take this one?
Yes, I do. So what to do? I know someone just asked in the chat, wear appropriate professional attire. I will not be wearing my t-shirt for my interview. I actually think the virtual interview, you don't have to wear, I don't want to say you don't have to wear a suit and then you end up with a faculty member or a staff or a student interviewer that is a little more traditional. I always would tell you, like, lean on the safe side. You just never know who you're going to get. I've been very surprised at, in the hospital, some people are just, they need you to wear your white coat when you go into a patient room. They need you to wear scrubs at this time. They need you to wear, you just never know that unhidden, what we call the hidden curriculum that some people mentally have, where they have this expectation. So I always say over prepare, over professionalize yourself, just in case you end up meeting a traditionalist. Always be on time. Your interviewer can be late. They might have no, there's no fault. And most interviewers, just speaking for myself, if one interview runs late, they will always make up for that at the end of the interview, but always be on time and waiting for them, because you want them to come into the room with you waiting for them, not the other way around. For virtual interviews, you're usually in a waiting room. The interviewer owns the link and then they accept you into that waiting room. If you're waiting in the waiting room, it's been 5 minutes, wait in the waiting room. It might just mean that you're having a robust conversation with the other applicant and they're going to give you the same amount of care and time. So just because you're 5 minutes late doesn't mean that you're going to switch off your Zoom link and then write them an email that your interviewer didn't show. Maybe 15 minutes, you're concerned. I would say more than 10 minutes, maybe you should, like the admissions committee, and in an email while you're still on the link. In-person interviews, you're waiting there. I would say give them that 10-15 minutes before you declare that you're a no-show. Just because sometimes if these people are clinicians, they're running late in clinic, just giving your interviewer that grace, but you are the interviewee. So being on time is always great. Be cautious to everyone you interact with, really. Most people are going, when just thinking of the admissions committee, we have admissions staff that do a wonderful job putting the interview day together. If you're in person, you go and you have lunch, you meet everyone, people in the cafeteria, you have med students or volunteers who are doing the tours for you. These people are volunteering their time, even if they're paid to be there. You just never want to come across as someone who we would not recommend being around patients at the end of the day. Like, it's not even that we're walking on a high horse and you should treat us with respect, but you should treat everyone with respect. And every single person who you interact with can come back to the admissions committee informally or formally to address something that they felt might have wronged them or like rubbed them the wrong way. So make sure you're being cautious, even to your fellow interviewee. I mean, I would go as much as say, like, those are going to be your colleagues someday. Some people I ended up at Dartmouth, some people I interviewed with, I ended up connecting with them through social media and other forums. And I'm like, oh my God, you ended up here at Georgetown or Case Western or Michigan. We're all going to be colleagues someday, right? So you always want to make sure you're being cautious to your fellow applicants too, because they might not report you, but people remember. People do. Use concrete and lived examples. When I ask a question, one of my really good questions I like to ask is, what's a book, a poem, or TV show or documentary you've seen that made you think about things a different way? And when people use concrete lived examples, I think that grounds them and it makes me interact with that question a little more. So always make sure you're giving us, when you're answering, like, you're giving us an authentic view of who you are outside this 30-minute version of you that we're seeing. Balancing speaking time, especially in your MMI and group time. I am someone, I find myself rambling a few times. Make sure you're not take up space. I don't take up space. You're there, you want to project that you're someone that can come in and put your voice where it matters, but make sure you're giving other people the same amount of respect and space too. Speak professionally, yet conversationally. If you find that you're answering your interviewer with yes, no, maybe you should like take a pause and give them like a more conversational answer. You just don't want to give them a rehearsed, like, oh my God, this is where I am, da 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 da. And then at the end, they don't ask you a follow-up. You can gauge if you're having a conversation by how much follow-up questions your interviewer asked you. Because if they're just like, okay, and then they just ask you something else, it means there was no hook in whatever answer you just gave them. And they're just like, okay, let me move on. Obviously, that's going to happen in some answers, but if that happens throughout your interview, maybe take a pause for your next interview to think back of how you could have answered or worded things differently. We said, have questions to ask your interviewer and send a thank you note. I know. I feel like this is like, I like thank you notes, not because of just personally, just because sometimes like I really get invested in my interviewees. I've read your files sometimes twice. I'm just excited to meet them. So, and if we shared something that I really enjoyed, like a book, I like to like go back and say like, oh, I'm going to make sure I read this book. Or if I share the book with them, I'm going to make something. So a thank you note doesn't have to just say thank you. A thank you note is just maybe sometimes summarizing some of the highlights of your interview. I find that the best thank you notes do that. I really liked when we talked about this. It just showed that you were listening during the interview. So don't just use that. Then everyone has a template, a thank you note template, but make sure you're like tailoring that. You want to make your interview. I mean, a lot of people in medicine have egos, really. And that ego, it's not, sometimes it can be in a bad way, but not in a bad way, in a sense where they feel like they just had that nice conversation with you. So giving them that summary back in that thank you note can really go, can really push a mile. A thank you note hasn't swayed me from a candidate who I liked or didn't like. But a thank you note can just mean that I remember you and that conversation a little longer.
Neil, I know you answered this in the Q&A, but just want to circle back here. We did have someone ask if it's common for interviewers to give out their contact information during the interview, or if that's something you need to ask for, or if an email is sufficient enough for a thank you note. So Neil, I don't know if you just want to expand on that a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah. From what I remember, most of the time the email addresses are given out. An email is more than sufficient for a thank you note. Please don't like send handwritten letters or,
No.
I think that's just fine. And it's always nice, like Amaka mentioned, to mention something that you guys shared in common in a thank you note. Or if you have any real follow-up questions, put them in the thank you note. Don't just ask questions, just ask questions. You're wasting both of our time. But if you have anything that you're really interested in or that you wanted to follow up on, you get time to talk about in the interview. That's totally appropriate. And then the one thing I would add to what Amaka said, totally agree. Great overview of what to do. Is that if an interviewer doesn't follow up on a response that you had, sometimes it may mean that your response wasn't interesting. Sometimes it may mean that this is like the trend now in interviews, having just gone through a bunch of interviews for residency, is that a lot of people aren't supposed to show emotion anymore. Like it's supposed to be purely behavioral. They're not supposed to show any favor towards certain candidates versus others. I wouldn't be discouraged if it happens. I would take it as a positive sign if they do respond to your questions, but I certainly wouldn't take it as a negative sign if they don't. That could be their personality. That could be what they're instructed to do by their admissions committee or whoever the head of their admissions committee is. So I just wanted to throw that little piece of information in there too.
I would love to echo that. One of my interviewer, I remember him being so rigid. I was like, oh my God, he definitely did not like me. And now I'm a student. And he was like, oh my God, I loved your interview. I remember this and I remember that. And I was like, what do you mean? That was, you showed me nothing. You gave me nothing that whole interview. So just know that just a lot of, especially faculty, like they've been doing this for a long time. They sometimes might not be as smiley or as enthusiastic when they're giving you answers or talking to you. Does not mean they did not like you as a candidate. They are probably going to, you'll be surprised who ends up being like your strongest advocate.
All right, fantastic. Let's move on to what not to do.
Yeah, I'll make this one quick because I think it's mostly common sense. So do not, do things that you wouldn't do if you were meeting like a close family member, like someone that you, if you were in any interview at all for any setting. Just don't do things like swear. Don't tell graphic, gory stories, or anything else that could be viewed as trying to shock the interviewer into remembering you. There are other ways to get the interviewer to remember you. I mean, just tell stories about yourself, about, why you're here, what makes you unique. You don't have to go for that shock factor. We already went over not reading or being robotic about your interviews. Don't over rehearse. Don't just read off your resume. We pretty much already read most of that stuff. We kind of know your resume for the most part. And if we don't, listing off your accomplishments is not going to help you get into the school. Sometimes you may just not have any questions, which is fine. I think the general rule of thumb is try to have one or two, and don't just end the interview early if you can avoid it. But, if you really have nothing to say, that's totally fine. My view on humor, I threw in a lot of humor in my interviews. I think you just got to read the room. If you throw in a joke and the person's just not responding or not having it, like, maybe just don't do it again. But if they're joking with you, it's totally okay to joke back. If they're smiling at you, it's totally okay to smile back. Kind of, again, like, this is echoing on just mimicking what the interviewer is doing to you. But I think throwing in jokes is great. I think that kind of shows you're a real person. And kind of running along with that, just don't be negative. Try not to talk poorly about other people, poorly about faculty. Try to remain positive. And even if they ask you about a poor interaction with another teammate or something like that, don't talk negatively about the person as a person. Maybe talk about the situation as being overall poor and how you handled that. The last thing maybe is, if a person asks you a question, try to answer the question. Don't try to go off topic. If you don't have a good answer to that question, you're totally welcome to take 20 to 30 seconds to think about an answer to that question before you answer it. But don't talk about something completely different that probably is not going to work in your favor.
I have a few don'ts. One of my don'ts is when you first come into an interview, I've always from most of my interviews, I'm always like, how is the best way to start an interview? And I think letting the interviewer start the interview is a good neutral ground. Some students come in and they're like, hi, I'm Chiamaka Okorie. I actually think just let the interviewer lead the interview. They might have a format. Some people are really rigid. So if you come in and you ruin their format, that can actually throw off how they interact with in the rest of the interview. So I would always say, come in and see. They might be like, hi, introduce themselves and then ask you to introduce yourself, or go straight to tell me about yourself, but give them that space to start and be the one to open that space. Another don't I agree with don't be negative. A lot of people come into med school thinking they were going to do one specialty, right? Which is, I would say, a lot of people who have gone through med school know that. I say that like a fourth year. I am still not there, but they know that the best way to approach med school is to come in with an open mind, because really you just don't know what would speak to you, what patient interaction will call to you, and you want to be the full physician, right? Even if you end up being this very niche interventional cardiologist, you want to be that full physician. And especially that's why we do 4 years of med school. So if you have that one niche specialty interest you have, except they ask you about that, don't always come in with trashing other specialties and reiterating that I'm just here to do orthopedics, or I'm just here to do derm, I'm just here to do cardio, or I'm just here to do no other specialty. I would say please lean away from that and make sure you're coming in with that bush-eyed, I'm so curious about medicine, and I would love to come in and gain whatever knowledge you all in your school of medicine will impact on me. So please be cautious about that.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. That wraps up everything that we have. So if anyone else has any other Q&As, feel free to pop those in the Q&A box. And I think Neil, you responded to a ton of these, but we can go over a couple of them as well, just for the recording purposes. But we did just get one, how do you recover from a freeze moment?
Yeah, totally happy to answer that. So, we tell you not to over rehearse, right? Which is good. You won't be prepared for every answer. Sometimes you're going to get an answer thrown at you that you just don't know what to do with. And sometimes you freeze. You just don't know what to say in that moment. My general go-to is, can I take 20 to 30 seconds to think about that answer? You recover yourself. You can look off camera for a little bit. They kind of know that you're thinking. We hope to throw you off. We hope to throw you an answer that you didn't rehearse, just so we can see what you do with it, and see how you can think on your feet. So I would not be thrown off personally by that. It's totally fine for you to take 30 seconds to answer. We expect that you may have to think about an answer. So that would be my advice for recovering from a freeze moment.
And just adding to that, when you freeze, don't add fillers that end up adding to that moment and adding to that the weirdness of the moment. Some people freeze and they'll be like, well, that was a really good question. Take that time, really take that space for yourself to really think. And that shows the interviewer that you're really like looking within and you're thinking. So trying to add fillers while you're thinking.
One question we got was, how do we include those most important and often complex parts of ourselves in such a short, concise form? And if I remember correctly, I think this came in when we were talking about the elevator pitch. So maybe we can spend a second just talking about that.
Yeah, so the tell me about yourself question, I usually recommend keeping it to like 60 seconds. So, I don't remember exactly what my telling me about yourself answer was, but I might say something like, hey, my name is Neil Jarrett. I grew up in Southern Indiana. I went to Notre Dame for college. I studied this and this. Couldn't really decide on what I wanted to go into, explored a lot of different career options, eventually decided on medicine. You don't really have to go into what reasons you decided on it for, but you can if you have time. And then you can say, I'm interested in medicine for these reasons, and I, outside of academic time, I really like to play tennis. I love to travel. I love to hike. I love to do this hobby, whatever. Within 30 seconds, you've kind of encapsulated a good bit about yourself, things the interviewer can hook onto. You really don't have to tell an entire story about yourself. That's the rest of the interview. That's what that's for. This is just kind of like, person to person, who are you? Who am I talking to? Please show me that you're a normal human, and then we can get on with this conversation.
Great.
And just depending on that, I know you're saying most important, often complex. I think this is where vocabulary really helps, in asking your mentors for how do I frame this. If you're speaking about having challenges growing up, if it was a health challenge, you can put it in that very short format of, I can give Chiamaka from Nigeria, born and raised, first generation, and you can clue in to whatever that important, complex part of yourself are. I was interested in medicine because I was always in the hospital because my mom was sick, like that, summarized with whatever clear vocabulary. Just think about that. That's what this preparedness, that's where that comes in, right? Like, what is that? I know you can write a 500-word secondary essay on that, but what is that? How can I just say that in 1 or 2 words? And you can ask your friends, they know you. Does this sound like me? And they will probably give you a good way to phrase it.
All right, I think we have time for one last question, and that's, do either of you have tips for summarizing, concluding, saying thank you for MMI interviews specifically? How can you send thank you notes for those, especially because you're interviewing with so many different people?
MMIs are weird, man. Like, you just you're not gonna have a great conclusion. I remember very distinctly an MMI at Michigan. It was an ethical scenario. I was role playing with a medical student who's a third year. We got into a legitimate argument by minute 4. By minute 5, he just ended the interview and started laughing, and I started laughing, and that was the end of the interview, and we walked out. It's like you have so little time, and you may be doing such a variety of things that there's no good way to end the conversation. You probably won't even get the names of your interviewers for MMIs. Generally, it's not really even a thing that you talk to them long enough that they would remember you very well. They just kind of put in a short evaluation for how you did, and that aggregate of evaluations is what kind of gets looked over at the end of the day. So I wouldn't stress too much about sending thank yous for MMIs, if I'm being honest.
Fantastic. All right. Well, Chiamaka and Neil, I want to thank you both so much for being here, for giving us all of this fantastic information. And to everyone who attended, thank you so much. Look out for an email in the coming days that will have a recording of this webinar. And for those MMI specific questions that you've all had, we do have an upcoming webinar on Tuesday night. We'll devote a whole hour to MMI. So feel free to sign up for that on our website. And we look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you so much.
If you're interviewing this season, good luck.
Yes.